Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. We have an exciting new show for you today. But first, let me introduce my co-host, Micah Current. Micah, how are you doing today?
Well, for 7:30 on a Monday, I'm not bad. So, how are you?
Uh, not bad. I felt like I adjusted to the time change well, and I think I prepared my kids to adjust to the time change well.
Wait, the time changed?
Yeah, time change Sunday.
I'm being sarcastic.
It was funny. So actually, it was funny. Someone posted. Someone I know from church posted, going, "Hey, remember to set your clocks back so you don't show up early to church." I'm thinking, don't tell people. If there's one day, don't tell people because then they'll actually show up to church either early or on time. If you don't tell them.
Yeah, I was telling some of my team yesterday, I was like, some of the ones that like are notoriously late. I was like, today's one of the days where you have no excuse to be late because you got an extra hour of sleep.
Yeah, yeah, but actually, even so, because like Sunday, my son I could hear the dog going, like I need to go to the bathroom and eat. And I'm looking at the clock. It's like 5:30. So I get up, I go take him down. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Take him out to go to the bathroom. Don't feed him till like 6, just to kind of get his schedule regulated. And then there's my son playing Mario. I'm like, dude, it's 5:30 in the morning. He goes, it's 5:30. The clock in the kitchen said it was 6. I'm like, 6:30. I'm like, yeah, there was a time change. The clocks in the kitchen don't change. So it's like, oh, and then of course my daughter actually slept. So that was a huge blessing because then both of them would have been getting me up at 5:30. And I'm like, kids,
Yeah.
no, no.
I also think it's incredibly amazing how early your children get up.
I don't know why. I really don't.
Well, subconsciously, I remembered that the time was going to change Saturday, but I went to bed and I went to sleep, thinking, hey, I got to get up and I got to go lead worship in the morning and I got to get things ready at the church. But I woke up and I'm like, did it change? It was one of those like flashback moments where I was like, oh yeah, I did. And then I woke up earlier than I was supposed to, and which I'm not complaining about. Um, it was kind of a deja vu moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Wonderful. All right. So, weird stories. Micah, you already told me you had a doozy of a weird story, so I'll let you jump right into it.
I don't know if you're ready for this.
I don't know if I'm ready for anything.
You're not ready for anything on a Monday?
No.
Do you have a case of the Monday, Scott?
Yeah, have a case of the Mondays.
So usually for our weird stories segment, I go off on a rant about how, something didn't go right or something went, incredibly wrong or, just in my mind, things not to do on a Sunday, right? And it almost turns into like a pastoral counseling session during the Scott Stedman podcast. But on Sundays, I usually when I get home in the afternoon, I kind of flip through YouTube and flip through Facebook and just see what other churches are doing, like worship sets. What are they doing with their lights? What are they doing with their um, teaching? What kind of series are they doing? Are they doing lower thirds? What does their branding look like? What kind of slides are they using? Like all the aesthetic stuff of a church, just to see what I can, learn and what I can, you know, use in my own ministry. And so yesterday, I kind of did that, but I kind of didn't. And then, we get ready for bed, and I take a shower in the morning. Alicia takes a shower at night, and while she's in the shower, I'm usually watching something on my iPad. So for whatever reason, I was in this rabbit trail on YouTube of different churches yesterday. And I'm not going to mention the church or the pastor, but I get to a church yesterday that I know is fairly Pentecostal, and it's in the Southwest Ohio area. And so I'm flipping through, and man, this worship is like jiving, right? They got this big show choir, and they're dancing, and they got these huge robes on. It kind of looks like what you'll look like, Scott, when you get your PhD, with these huge
Mm.
robes on. And you
Or
know,
Sister Act.
yes, that too. Um, you know, worship's very much a call and response, right? He's like, well, let's
Yeah.
sing that chorus again. And like just kind of
Hmm.
just, it's very, very Pentecostal. And so I am flipping through this and I'm like, it's 10:30 at night. And I'm like, this is just too much. And I get to the point where the pastor comes up. Now I know this church is fairly conservative, like in their political views. And we
Hmm.
shared and we've talked on other topics on uh, your show about politics from the pulpit and politics in
Yeah.
general and things like that. Scott, I'm not lying to you. When the pastor gets up to preach, he has a t-shirt on. And my wife, by that time she was finished getting ready for bed and she had laid next to me and she looked at my iPad. She's like, "Is that Jesus on the t-shirt?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's Jesus." Scott, this pastor had a t-shirt with Jesus, but the Jesus on the t-shirt had a "Make America Great Again" baseball hat on.
Oh, no. Was it the what? Was it just a random picture of Jesus? Or was it like the stereotypical Warner
The
Salzman
stare
Jesus?
the stereotypical, you remember the one like Jesus like praying in the Garden of Gethsemane? Like kind of
Yes.
like he just kind of like a side picture of
Yeah.
him.
That's a,
Yeah,
yeah.
it kind of was that, but it had him with a "Make America Great Again" Donald Trump hat on top of it.
Oh my god.
If I'm lying,
Was there an AK in his hands too?
no. But he did have jeans, cowboy boots on, and a giant belt buckle as well.
Wasn't wearing like a bearskin cap onto then the American Great. Oh
You
my
want
gosh.
you want to talk about politics from the pulpit?
You don't even have to say anything. Just wear that shirt. It says it all. It says it all. Oh my. Oh my. Gosh.
I think we can just stop
Hey.
recording now and just call it a day.
And welcome to thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast.
What do you think of that,
Oh
Scott?
gosh. What do I think of that? That's ridiculous. Oh my gosh. Oh, that is so ridiculous. I just don't. I know we have a political season coming up, and actually, we'll be
Tomorrow,
voting for. Well, yeah, tomorrow for
midterms.
general elections, midterms, but then 2000. I think it's 2020
For
23 is well 2024, but 2023 is when we're really going to start seeing kind of that headway
ramp up
of
season.
ramp up season to the presidential election. And you know, I'm so glad I'm not a lead pastor during political seasons. Just going through the 16 and the 2020 was just,
Probably brutal.
it was brutal. I mean, it was brutal. And I think 2020 was even more brutal because not only did you have that, but then you had COVID and everything else. And I think I would say that's probably one of the reasons why a lot of pastors were kind of done. I mean, we could say burnout because they're trying to do a lot of new things, get live streaming up, doing like their parking lot messages and had to do a lot more work and as far as like care and checking in on people since you're not seeing people. But I really think that the whole political culture and how deep rooted some of those seeds and some of those roots were in the church and how much people were arguing and fighting about stuff, politics in the church. I'd say, yeah, it's pretty much I think that's pretty much what's killed a lot of pastors and why they resigned in the
Well,
last couple of years.
I had a friend recently that I ran into, and he's been a youth pastor for 10 years. And I ran into him recently here, and he and his wife and their kids actually moved to Trenton where we live. And um, recently I saw that he took a new job, and I was like, "Hey, are you going to be bivocational or something like that?" And he's like, "No, the church." And I was like, "You left the church or you left ministry?" He was like, "Well, I'm taking a break from ministry, but I left the church that I was at." And I'm like, "Well, if you don't mind me asking, um, why did you leave? And he said, not to get into the nitty gritty of it, but like, not that I'm one side or the other, but he said that things got too political for for the point, Scott, that you're just making. Things got a little too muddy in respect to how people were communicating from the pulpit, and how leadership is talking about politics and um, guiding their ministry as such. And so he was like, I'd done 10 years of student ministry, and you add that on top of a very rabid climate politically. He was like, I just needed a break and I needed out. So it's
Mm-hmm.
just, I'm just
Yeah.
adding to your point. Like
Yeah.
it's sad. It's sad, like it didn't used to be this way.
Yeah.
And we are sound like a bunch of old men sitting at,
Well, I mean, I
McDonald's
think,
drinking our coffee on a Monday
yeah.
morning at 5 a.m. But like it did it,
Yeah.
even with like, it's gotten so toxic, I think is the right word for it.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I think that it was always there as a kid. There'd be times where I'd see people talk about politics in like the lobby or the narthex or sometimes in the sanctuary about something, but it was always cordial. Like even if there's
Mhm.
disagreement, no one was like, "Oh, well, you're a you're a you're a Democrat, so you're a baby killer," or anything like that. Like no one would really say that. They go, "Okay, well, I disrespect your view, but I love you because you're a brother or sister in Christ," and that's what really matters. And
Yeah.
plus, there's other views that there's other political views that that you're voting for, and the abortion topic's not the main thing that makes you vote or be a Democrat or Republican. And I think back then it was different because people had a little bit more respect because they knew that, hey, church is church, and if you're a Christian, I love you because you're a follower of Jesus Christ, and doesn't matter social economic status, political affiliations, all that stuff doesn't really matter. And now it seems like it's kind of mattering now, and people are getting really geared up, and that's the thing that I think is different, or gets very toxic, because now it's kind of to the point where the beast is unleashed, and pastors have to kind of try to tame the beast or try to kill the beast, and either way, there's going to be blood everywhere. So
Yeah.
it usually
And
falls back on the pastor.
well, when we talk, if we talk about the gospel, when we talk about Jesus, like Jesus didn't care about that stuff. Like he was actually the anti-government, anti-establishment, right? He wanted to just love everybody and love uh,
Mm-hmm.
people for who they were. And you know, the probably overused phrase "love the sinner, hate the sin" kind of
Mm-hmm.
comes to mind. But it's um, yeah, I don't know. Even as much as I tend to lean on the conservative nature of, or the conservative side of things, I'm not going to wear a Jesus T-shirt with a "Make America Great Again" baseball hat on.
Yeah.
So I just thought
Yeah.
you would enjoy that.
Oh goodness. All right. Yeah. So my weird
So you
stories
pulled a weird
definitely.
story from the vault.
Yeah. So then this is actually not fresh, but there's still a little bit of freshness on it because it's actually been about a month since I came across this story. So occasionally I'll always like come across like youth ministry fails and hear some of the weirdest, strangest things that happen in youth ministry. A lot of it's just more of like, I could tell like when I'm reading these stories or I'm hearing them, it's mostly just this is probably like someone's first gig in youth ministry. They're probably in their like early 20s, and they're going to make mistakes. Like, it's like a bonehead mistake. Like, oh yeah, that's something I would do it when I was in the camp ministry at that age. Like, so sometimes I can kind of relate to them, and sometimes I'm looking like, oh, that's a bad idea. Well, there was one youth pastor who got fired, and rightfully so, because he had this idea to make stickers, youth stickers, and maybe you've heard this, but he made a youth sticker that said, "I heart hot youth pastors," and handed them out to all the students. And apparently it was so he handed them out to the students, and of course students are creeped out by this, which rightfully so. They show these stickers to their parents. So the parents are like, whoa, what the heck is this? So then this pastor ends up apologizing and sends something out to the church and also sends something out on social media because it went viral. And the pastor's excuse was, sorry, I wasn't thinking. I was doing a play off the I Love Hot Moms thing, but I thought it'd be funny to put youth pastors. Well, he got fired for that. Which rightfully so, because even if you're doing a play on the I Love Hot Moms, still, I don't know where anything in, I don't even know how you could make an I Love Hot fill in the blank appropriate in a Christian sphere. Like, I love hot Christian guys, I love hot Christian girls. Like, even that's kind of cringe. So I sit there and I really go, okay, I can understand like when there's some youth ministry fails, how I could think like in the mindset, like, oh, that'd be funny or that'd be kind of a good idea. And then you put it into practice and go, oh, that was an awful idea. But I can't think of any logical thought that someone thought this was a good idea. Let's put this to print, make about 1,000 stickers of this, and hand them out to my students.
Yeah, who thought that was a good idea?
Someone obviously didn't consult their team saying, hey, I have this crazy idea for a fundraiser. Let's make these stickers. And someone go, yeah, no, let's not. It's hard. Which I know we've talked a lot about. Make sure you double check. If you have an idea for your sermon, double check with your board. Double check with something you think something's going to be a little bit too controversial, or you don't know, or you need guidance. Like, this person's like, oh, this is a good idea. Let's just put it to print and pay church funds to pay for all these stickers that the church probably had to like throw away or maybe just burn them because like, oh, this is a bad idea. We're burning all these. Yeah. Weird.
That is weird. That's bad. That's cringy.
That's like bad weird, like cringy, bad weird. Like yeah, very, very weird. And I love, and that's the thing that I love about students and I love about children is that if something's off, they're gonna say something. Like they're gonna say something and be like, yeah, this is weird.
Kids are some of the most honest humans in the world.
Yeah, they're honest. Right? And if you're I mean, I still remember years ago when I first actually we were talking about I was telling someone about how I got on the camp and how it was about the worship leader who was coming and playing, how I knew him from years, and actually he was a camper when I was a counselor. And I couldn't remember if I was on staff or if it was the year that I counseled the whole summer before staff. And one of the reasons I say I have a hard time remembering that those 2002, 2003 is because the staff was so hostile to each other. There was some backstage drama that there were a couple of times where I was asked to do things as a staff member and I wasn't even staff because I was there the whole time. And I'm like, but I'm not staff, like, because none of the staff would show up to events because they just didn't want to be around each other because it was just getting very bad. So, but yeah, it was, but that's a story for another day. Back in the archives of Scott's camp stories, which we won't get into all those. Oh goodness. So Micah, what are we talking about today?
So I kind of alluded to it a couple of weeks ago, but like I kind of wanted to talk through, your experience as a lead pastor and my experience as a creative arts pastor and kind of how you put services together. And the idea of putting services together and is it okay to add things last minute? Is it not okay to add things last minute? What's appropriate? What's not? Speaking of appropriate and not, and when is it appropriate? So, like, from the creative lens, I have always been one to plan services and to meet with my senior pastor and to say, hey, what are you thinking? Um, are you doing this series? Is it okay if we do these songs? Like, and I've done it, 100 different ways as far as like, this is how we plan services, because I think too, you have to think of, okay, it's not just, okay, the worship pastor and the lead pastor, they're it, right? No, this whole idea of planning services impacts a greater level of people. So it's not only the staff, but it's your volunteers that are helping, whether it's people running sound or media or lights. It's your volunteers that are singing on your praise team and your instrumentalists, your worship team. Um, it's also like could impact greeters, and it's just it occurred to me a couple of weeks ago. It's happened the last 2 or 3 weeks at the church that I'm currently serving at. That 2 or 3 minutes before service starts, somebody comes up and they're like, "Hey, can I give this testimony? And where should I put that in the service? Or who's doing announcements?" I send the order of service out, and I send it out usually by Tuesdays or Wednesdays each week. Sure enough, Sunday morning rolls around and nobody knows who's doing the announcements. And it's like, how do you not know this? Like I sent this out like on Tuesday, and it's the same every single week. So
Mhm.
Scott, what's your opinion on creating a service flow and sticking to that versus you know, just kind of being loosey goosey and small church mentality? Because a lot of that has
Yeah,
to do with small church versus big church. And what
yeah.
I mean by
So
small church versus big church is small church being a smaller in size congregation versus big church meaning, mid to
mhm.
large size.
Yeah, so being both a pastor and also being someone who sat through the big church experience, the small church experience, the mid church experience, and everything. It's very hard to develop a flow that works for everyone. And the thing about flow is you can't really, there's not like a cut and dry, like this is the best way to do a flow, because sometimes it could just be kind of the lead pastor's theology of how they want things to flow versus what's best for kind of the congregation. Bigger churches, they seem to have a little bit more of a better flow in some ways because they probably have another service or two services. So you can't be all loosey goosey because they're on a
Mm-hmm.
time constraint. Because once the other church, and especially like I know at the church I was attending at in Fishersville, they had a very small parking lot and they had three services. So there was a time where you had to be done at a certain time because then everybody who's getting in their cars and leaving is happening right at the same time when cars are coming in to find parking spaces to go to the next service. So you're constantly trying to make sure your time. So if you're doing announcements and you want to do a testimony or you want to add an announcement, sorry, it's probably going to be in an email or you're going to have to wait till next service and talk
Yeah.
to the pastor, talk to someone to get that happening because it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in a big church or smaller churches. If you have one service and everybody's there, and the mentality is that, in a lot of times, especially with smaller churches, especially older congregants, you're there until everything's done. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're not leaving until the service is done, until the benediction is prayed and the closing music is done. You're not leaving that service. So if it's 12 o'clock and we in pastors in mid sermon and it looks like it's going to be about a 1 o'clock before dismissal, you're sitting there till 1 o'clock, grumbling stomach. I mean, you may be angry and disgruntled, but you're sitting there because that's just kind of, you always stay for church. You stay from beginning to end.
Yeah.
So,
Um,
no, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, I think you're exactly right. And maybe that's my misconception or my um I guess my struggle with small church mentality because I've usually worked in bigger churches,
Mm-hmm.
um larger in size, and we've had multiple multiple services, so it's harder to add some of those things when you've got to get to the next service, right? I've worked in churches where we've had three services, and if you don't like, first service has to stay on time, second service has to stay on time. By the time you get to third service, you can just do whatever you want because there's no service after that. However, everybody's exhausted, all your volunteers are exhausted, and yeah, it continues to be, you have to be regimented, right? What were you going to say?
No, I was saying like, yeah, so kind of like with that, especially with smaller churches, a lot of times you can try, and I've tried before, like we have a certain flow and develop that flow and stay consistent to that flow. And I think the other problem with smaller churches is that since it's such kind of like a close-knit group of people, and it's kind of more of a family church in some ways, that family mentality, where you could have a good set service and you could start announcements, singing your three songs, going into prayer, going into offering, going into another song before the sermon, preach the sermon. And then you could think, oh man, this is flowing very nicely. And then you can get to the benediction song. And someone on your worship team can just say, pastor's message just really spoke to me. And they could go give a 30-minute testimony right there on the spot without permission, without, hey, is it checking and seeing, is this okay? Because really all they're doing is they have the mic, so they have the power, and they're just going to go. And then here's the thing, and this is, I think, the challenge for pastors, because if you cut that off and say, nope, sorry, we got to wrap it up,
then you look like the bad guy.
You look like the bad guy. And then you just not only offended the person who wanted to share the testimony, but then you also offend everybody else in that room, because it's like, hey, apparently God was doing something in this person and you decided not to talk about it. But then sometimes it's not necessarily, it's like I had a student who went to a bigger church and she liked going to the youth group, but she hated going to Sunday service because it was very, very charismatic. And she would tell me every time, like when the pastor would go up to preach the sermon, this woman would stand up and start speaking in tongues for about 15 minutes and blah, 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 like whatever. This is my student's example. And then she sit back down and the pastor goes, man, the Lord's doing amazing things in this place. And he goes sit down and we go do closing song. Dude never preached a sermon. So for 15 minutes, my student just heard blah, 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 blah. And then that was it. And that was her worship experience, was music, someone speaking in gibberish for 15 minutes, pastor saying, blessed be the name of the Lord, go sit back down. And then they close out the service. And she's like, I'm really conflicted because I really like being in this youth group and I really feel connected and really feel that God is moving in this youth group and I feel like he's doing a great work in me. But then I go into the service and it's just awful. Like this lady, and it's like that every single Sunday. And I'm thinking, someone needs to just say, lady, sit down. It is not your time to speak. But if you have that small, and I think that was a mid-sized church that was happening at too. And it's like, it disrupts the whole flow and the whole service.
Yeah, I think too, and I'm not, and this is, I'm not here to criticize or be critical of small churches or big churches or anything like that. But like, if anything, people like consistency in a world where there's inconsistency. And so kind of the larger church model of, all right, here's our service flow, and it's pretty much the same every week because we have multiple services. Some of that may change, like the elements of that may change. Let's talk about that really quick. Like, so if you're in a big church or a mid-sized church and your service flow is, pre-service music, pre-service slides, 5-minute countdown, 5 minutes before service starts. One, welcome to church. Let's stand together. Songs one, songs two, or song one and song two, and then hey, turn your attention to the screen for this week's video announcements, which that happens a lot in bigger churches because you have somebody who can, video announcements and produce that content every week. Tell your folks to have a seat while the video announcements are going on. Sometimes a host pastor will come up and just remind people, thank people for being there, and then, pray, and let's stand together and continue to worship. And then there's more of a ballad kind of worship block where you do songs 3 and 4, and then you pray. There's a sermon bumper video, and then the pastor preaches. And then there may or may not be a song at the end, depending on the time. But usually with things like Planning Center, you throw that stuff in there, it literally gives you a minute by minute breakdown of how many minutes your service is going to be. And so if your goal is to keep it at an hour and you have 3 services or 2 services or whatever on a Sunday morning, you got to stick to that hour, right? So if you have a 9:30 and an 11 service, or a 9:30 and 11:30, or whatever, 9:30, 10:30, it doesn't matter. You have that hour service, you have about a half hour buffer between, because Scott, you were talking about parkings, like, because if you're a bigger church but have a smaller parking lot, for example, it's harder to find parking. People are leaving as you're coming in. It can be a chore to find a parking spot in a smaller parking lot of the church. And so, that's just one example of doing it. So like if you wanted to take, for example, communion one week, you had communion, you knock a song out of that set, so you have time for that communion block. If you have a testimony video and you're doing, I don't know, I'm trying to think, if you're doing a sermon series on the book of Acts and you want to talk about how Jesus transformed your life, like they transformed the folks' lives in the book of Acts. Each week your sermon bumper is going to be a testimonial video of how Jesus changed Scott's life, how Jesus changed Micah's life. And each week you're doing that. And so that way you're getting those testimonies in without somebody taking the mic and talking for 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And they're also seen on the screens. It's cleaned up. And that's why I think things like video announcements and bumper videos are so much better, because, some people, Scott, can get up there and talk, but they're not the best public speaker. And you're like, what in the world is this person talking about? Because they're just rambling on and on and on, and they don't know how to. They don't know how to land the plane, right? My wife and I joke a lot about landing the plane in ministry. Like some pastors don't know how to land it when they're preaching. But go ahead.
No, and it's good. I mean, and flow's just and here's the thing, like when you have a good flow in your service, whether you realize it or not, it just makes the worship experience so much better. And not because we're taking it easy or we're developing a culture of comfort so there's no disorder, but things just seem to fly so smoothly. And there's a difference between having a one-off where, the batteries die in the mic set, or the guy who has the acoustic guitar, his 9-volt battery dies, and then his guitar goes dead, and then he's just kind of playing, and either someone puts the microphone, it takes time to put a microphone by the hole or get him a new 9-volt to put in the guitar to get the thing moving again. But it just is so much better. I mean, and I think in the same way, like it's the same way like with announcements too. Like we talked about announcements, but there's some churches who they'll play one song at the beginning to start service, and then we go right into announcements. And then there's some who do the announcements right at the beginning, even if everyone's still kind of going in, are going to miss the announcements. But then once those announcements are done, it is a worship block set from the time the first chord is played to the closing prayer. And it just flows so good. And I understand like those people who want to play the song first and then do the announcement, because then by the time the first song's played, everyone's in there. Now it's like, okay, here's a good time to make sure people know what's happening. But I feel like even in some cases, if it's not done well, then it's almost like, okay, we're getting in the worship. Okay, pause. Here's a commercial break. Play. Now we have the rest. It's like if you play the opening credits to a movie and you're getting into it, and all of a sudden you now see all the movie trailers for all the movies that are coming out in the middle of the movie. Like, you don't do that, but some churches do because they feel like making sure that people know what's happening at the church and all the announcements are very vital. And I think that's another
how do
thing
you,
about flow. Yeah.
yeah, I'm 100% with you. And I don't know if we've had this conversation, but like two things. One, to piggyback off of what you said, um, I, we joke about this all the time, but like you could put something in the bulletin, you could put something on the screens, you could put something on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You could you could create events on Facebook and put stuff on your website, and people would still be like, when is this happening? Like they just don't look like, or it's
Yeah.
just they're completely oblivious to the idea that people are promoting events in multiple platforms, and even saying it verbally from the platform itself at the church or on video announcements. Like you're seeing it, you're hearing it. I don't know, like there's always going to be that person, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't know when something is or why weren't they told about this event or that event. The other thing I wanted to ask you, Scott, was what's your opinion on meet and greets? And what I mean by that is like if we're in service and I do a song and say, again, we're so glad you're here. Turn around and greet somebody and just shake their hand or hug them. And I'm talking like pre-COVID, don't touch me
Yeah.
because you may have COVID kind of thing. But like, how do you feel about that? I have a point, but I wanted to hear yours.
I think it also depends on the size of the church. I really do,
Yeah.
because a smaller church, there's really no point in doing a meet and greet because you probably all met and greet each other. Met and greet. I don't even know if that's a word, gret, but you've already meet and greeted with one another in the sanctuary, in the lobby before service started. That was all
Thank
taken
you.
care of.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you so much for saying that.
but the church I'm at now, we do meet and greet, but at the same time, at the beginning of service, we may have like 15, 20 people right when the pastor's doing announcements. And then by the time the worship leader is in the middle of their first song, 30 or 40 more people show up because they're running behind.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
so, and then that way you can do a meet and greet, because if I was to do a meet and greet, even as a family minister, some families I'll start seeing coming in. So it's like, I want to say, oh, hey, how's everything going with you guys? Just build those relationships. But I can't, because I can't do that before service because they're not there. So I think a
Yeah.
lot of times if you have your mid-sized churches or your larger churches and they do that, I think a lot of times it's to, hey, people now strolled in, go do that. And I think at the same time, so I think that's the good thing about a meet and greet. At the same time, if meet and greet is you're standing there and you're going around and you're talking to people, then, and you're talking to the same people that's around you, then how are you getting to know more people?
Sure.
And even sometimes what I liked about meet and greets, and I'll say another good thing about meet and greets, you can always have that one person that's probably been a member of the church for years. You do meet and greet and nobody talks to them. And as a pastor, one of the things I do is I make sure I'm looking out. And even though I want to say hi to the people who say hi to me, but I'm intentionally seeking out that person
That person. Mm-hmm.
who everyone else is standing and they're sitting around and they stand there and they're just looking back and forth. And eventually they go and sit back down because it's like, well, no one's going to talk to me, shake my hand. So I'm just going to sit back down. So it's like, okay, I'm hunting for that person. And I'm going to say, hey,
Sure.
glad that you're here. How was your week? And talk to them. And I think in some cases that's good. And especially I noticed that a lot with people who've lost loved ones, that their loved one passed away. And it might have been like their spouse was the talkative one. And it was the one who during meet and greet time was always the one who was always walking around, shaking hands. And the other spouse would kind of ride the coattails of that. And now that outgoing, energetic spouse is now not in the picture. They just stand there and then no one talks to them because they weren't the life of the party. They were the introvert, So just having that one person saying, hey, glad you're here, it means the world of difference.
Well, speaking of which, people are introverted, right? And so my wife will be the first to tell you that she hates a meet and greet. She don't want people to come to, she doesn't like, especially people she doesn't know. Mm-hmm. Right? Like she's like she feels like that's incredibly uncomfortable for her. And so she dislikes meet and greets. Period. So, and I was telling the pastor at the church yesterday that I'm at, that one of the first churches I pastored, I had a guy on my worship team, one of my best friends, even to this day. His wife came up to me when I first started there and was like, don't you dare do meet and greets. I hate meet and greets. And she's like, don't ever ask me to pray. Don't ever ask me to come up and do anything public speaking related. Just don't want to do it. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. So the reason I bring up the meet and greet thing is that, like, I think that it's in bigger, larger settings, it's hard to do that because it's a bigger setting and it's harder to actually get to know more people because you're surrounded by hundreds of people, literally. And so you're not going to see the person who's clear across the auditorium from you because there's just so many, right? Mm-hmm. But in smaller churches, everybody knows everybody, right? And so, and I have a question to follow that up here in a few minutes, but the church that I'm currently serving, about 3 weeks ago, maybe even a month ago, the pastor was like, we don't have to do the meet and greet every week. Mm-hmm. It's not, they're meeting, like you said, Scott. And I said, and I said, thank you a few minutes ago. Like, people are meeting and greeting in the lobby. People are meeting and greeting in the hallway. People are meeting and greeting in the sanctuary before church even starts. Why do they need to quote, meet and greet again during service? And so that was, 3-4 weeks ago. And then about 3 weeks ago, I didn't do it. We just got up, we did worship, I prayed, pastor came up and preached. It was a really good service. We went home. And then about 2 weeks ago, pastor came up, and this is when I was, kind of sharing about our topic today about the idea of service flow. Like, I sent an order of service out, so why aren't we following it? And why are people coming up to me like left and right about, I want to do a testimony, and I want to do this, and I want to do that, and I want to talk. And pastor was like, let's do the meet and greet today. And I'm like, you just told me that we didn't want to do it anymore, or you weren't going to do it anymore, or we didn't have to do it.
Yeah.
And he was like, well, somebody said something.
Yeah, of course.
Inevitably somebody said something, which kind of leads me to my last question as we kind of wrap up our time in this conversation. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's why smaller churches don't grow?
Ooh, wow.
And the reason I ask that is because they're comfortable in the way that they do things. They know everybody. They want to do the service the way they want to do it. They want to do the testimonies they want to do it. They want to do the meet and greet the way they want to do it. Sometimes the pastor, and, like, I'm not discarding the fact that, the Spirit moves and mm-hmm. whoever the pastor is may or may not preach that week, because it may turn into a testimony service. It may turn into just to a full-blown time of worship, which is okay. But small, country church of about 50 people may or may not change or grow. And part of that is because they don't want to change and they don't want to grow. What are your thoughts?
I would say that, yeah, I would agree to that, because, again, it goes back to control. Mm-hmm. Like, the meet and greet, have a small church having a meet and greet is not going to kill your church. What's going to kill the church is control. When the congregation feels like they have control over how things are done in service. So as a pastor, if you're like, hey, I mean, we've talked about this before with music, styles of music. If pastor says, hey, if we want to reach younger families, we're going to have to adjust and probably do a more modern music choices or start integrating that into our worship service, and people are going like, no, we must always sing the hymns. I mean, I can remember I had one lady tell me we just need to sing hymns and grow the church by just singing hymns, and then when young families start showing up, then we switch over to doing modern music. And I'm thinking, if we're just doing hymns all the time, young families are not going to be showing up.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and again, that also goes back to the culture. I mean, you could have a church that does hymns and could be growing left and right because that's what that culture or that area, they just all want Southern gospel hymns and they don't like the whole modern stuff. And even the younger families who live out there are into the whole, that hymn Southern gospel style music. So they're gonna do that. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But it's not necessarily the music choice or meet and greets or anything else. It really boils down to control. And if the congregation, again, well, somebody said something, well, that doesn't mean that the pastor has control. It means that the congregation has control. So if somebody says something about not having meet and greet, is making a big stink about it, then you change course. Mm-hmm. Because you want to make sure that those people are happy and those people are not knocking on your door or calling you the next day going, hey, it was Easter and we didn't get to sing Up From the Grave He Arose. So we're going to complain about that because my favorite Easter song wasn't played in service. Well, it has nothing to do with the song. It had to do with control.
Yeah. Well, and to take it a step further, I don't think that some people know that they're in control and they're control, they're the controlling factor in the ministry that they're in. However, some people may not know because that's all they've ever known. Right. But I think it's fascinating that certain people, they do everything in the church. Right? They're the church secretary, or they're the ones doing the Facebook thing, and they're doing the live stream, and they're doing, and they're not letting anybody else do that. And then they wonder why the church doesn't grow. Like, why aren't you investing in people? Which is a whole nother conversation. But it's for me, it's sad when I drive around my little community and I see all these wonderful churches, and I'm like, man, in 10 years, if you don't change course, if you don't really think about changing some of the things that you're doing, then you may or may not be here, which is sad. But again, there's also no perfect formula or perfect science to it. But I think there's also a time and a place for everything. I mean, that's biblical too, right? I mean, that's scripture. But the idea of I don't know, it's I feel like you should trust the leaders that you've hired to do those jobs. And if that doesn't include certain elements, then they're obviously trying a strategy to better the ministry overall. But if it doesn't work, guess what? We can try other things. We don't need to keep doing the same things over and over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? It's just that's frustrating. I think that's more frustrating when you just continue to do things and don't see results and then argue about those things because it's appeasing to certain people in certain generations of the church. Oh, we're not singing Up From the Grave He Arose, or we're not doing the meet and greet, or we're not doing, we don't have flowers in front of this, in the front of the sanctuary, and we don't have candles lit. What? It's 2022. People's souls are more important than Up From the Grave He Arose, the hymn, or candles being lit. I just it just baffles me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, it does.
Service flow, man. I think it's important because
it is.
You create that branding, you create that culture.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a good point to end this on, is that when you have a good flow, you're creating culture. You're creating a culture of worship within your service. So if you have a certain formula that seems to work and it starts to draw people closer to the throne of God, then keep your flow. Keep that going. And then also just kind of be discerning too, as far as if you do have that person who has the testimony, you know, okay, if it fits, great. If it doesn't, you know, just say, just politely kind of interrupt and say, that's wonderful, especially if they start going on and on and on. Like, yep, good, like wonderful, like that's really
Try
good.
to
And
help
then
them
may
land
the
the
move,
jet.
yeah, try to help them land the jet. Exactly. But friends, thank you so much for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. Hopefully, if you're a pastor, hopefully or a church leader, hopefully this episode on church flow kind of helps give you some insight and help. Maybe it helps you maybe take a little bit more of a stance and go, you know what? Yeah, I don't have control over the service, so I need to start having more control and have a consistent flow to create that culture of worship within my congregation. So friends, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be back on next week with another episode. Take care.